and welcome back to my channel. Sorry I'm filming a bit later than normal because I've had a very busy week. Had lots of meetings online. I did some training earlier on in the week on autism and adolescence to some professionals. I get paid just like pocket money. With a local autism training organisation, and that took up most of Wednesday. And then I have two groups I attended. I attended a book club that I attend online, and another two autism groups that I attend online. So it's been quite a busy week and I just haven't had time. But I'd like to carry on reviewing Autism and Asperger's Syndrome in Children by Dr. Luke Beardon from where I finished off last time. So I got up to, in the last video, I got up to the bit where I was talking about autistic sociability and how autistics can be sociable. It's a myth that autistics can't be sociable. It's just that autistic sociability is often different to non-autistic sociability, which is where the confusion lies. The next bit of the book talks about spiky profiles. Now, I don't know if you've heard of spiky profiles in relation to autism, but it's often talked about in autism literature. What it means is that in autism there's often a very uneven set of skills. So the likelihood is that you're going to be really good in some areas but really struggle in other areas, whereas in non-autistic people it's more uniform. That's not to say obviously non-autistic people have their strengths and weaknesses, obviously, that goes without saying. A non-autistic person is going to have things they're really good at and things they're not so good at. But the difference is that in autism, these differences are far more extreme and often quite baffling to people who don't know much about autism because of the extremity of the difference. So, for example, in my case, I learned to read early before I started school, and you'd expect that a child who can read in terms of like decoding words and doing that stuff pretty early, you'd expect that their comprehension would be of a similar level. Because that's normally what's expected. But in my case, my comprehension lags significantly behind my chronological age, while my reading level was years ahead of my chronological age. So there's this massive gulf, and so that's kind of what I mean by spiky profile. And also, obviously, I found it really hard to calculate, got dyscalculia, and really struggled with maths and numbers. And things like that. It can also mean that you might be able to talk really well, like I can. Like you might have great expressive ability in terms of your ability to kind of formulate sentences, and yet your ability to comprehend, say, sarcasm, metaphor, and things like that might be lagging a lot behind. Again, making people confused because they think you should be able to understand these things because you talk so well. So that's what I mean by a spiky profile. You can probably relate if you're autistic. So Luke Beardon specifically talks about this in the context of verbal communication. And he says how, non-autistics, the predominant neurotype, tend to have very similar skills in expressive and receptive verbal communication. So similar skills in terms of their ability to articulate themselves and their ability to understand what is being said to them by others. So the ability to talk at any level is usually very similar to the level at which they understand spoken language. But an autistic may be non-verbal with excellent communication. So in other words, they might not have expressive ability, but they might actually be pretty good at other types of communication. But conversely, you could have excellent expressive language with difficulties understanding others' spoken words, particularly like, say, metaphor and things like that, particularly in fast-moving scenarios. So yeah, I can relate to this because I can talk very well. I often talk about this actually as being my greatest disability in a sense, because people see the fact I could talk really well, and they then don't understand how much I struggle with receptive communication, because they see me, I present as very, very articulate, and this disguises my disability, and means that people assume that I must be able to live like a non-autistic person. It puts a kind of, they assume things about me that are simply not true, and that then means that I feel often that people do not understand the extent of my disability in terms of the non-verbal side, and this can be quite alienating and difficult for me because it's so hard to explain to people what I struggle with when they in a sense get the wrong impression by how well I can talk, and I do feel that's one of my greatest disabilities in a sense. I struggle, making sense of verbal communication coming at me from other people because I struggle with my processing speed. So I often need people to repeat things to me, to go more slowly. I want to be able to rewind what they've just said. If I could do that, things would be so much easier because I will process what they're saying and I will take it in and understand it, but it takes me a lot longer. And of course, when you're in a fast-paced scenario, when people are talking and giving you lots of information, and I can't process it all at the speed they expect me to, then that can be problematic because I'm left not really understanding the situation. But because I can talk so well, people don't realise this and how difficult it is for me. And that's because of that spiky profile that Luke Beardon talks about. So an autistic person might be a brilliant orator at a conference, but this does not mean they're going to be any good at social chit-chat. Yeah, exactly, that's the case for me. He talks on page 50 about sensory profiles, and sensory profiles can change over time. So, for example, someone could have really struggle with a sensory issue at one point in their life, and then this could literally disappear overnight potentially. So an autistic child might be intolerant to the noise of the vacuum cleaner one day, and then all of a sudden it's no longer a problem. They could just outgrow it like that, I used to hate a vacuum cleaner when I was young. I still don't like the vacuum cleaner noise. If I'm doing the vacuum cleaning, then it's fine because I'm in control of the noise. But I don't like other people vacuum cleaning. But I can put up with it now, but I couldn't when I was a child. So these issues, they can change and grow over time, they're not constant. A child may be very sensitive to noise, but noise in one environment may not be tolerated, while noise in another may be acceptable. This can be very confusing for people, because it's not the case that just because you struggle with something, with a particular sensory input in one environment, this is going to be problematic in all environments. And it also depends on your mood and all these other factors, how tired you are, what other things will be going on in your day, whether or not you can escape from the noise, how long the noise lasts for, whether or not there's any other sensory discomfort. This can all impact on how well you cope with a sensory input, and it could change from day to day. Yeah, I can completely relate to that. And he mentions here, how a child's general well-being, a child's general well-being would impact massively on their tolerance level to sensory issues, for example, their mental state, anxiety, for example. Obviously, all this applies to adults as well, it's just that the book is about specifically autism in children, but it applies to adults too. He talks about anxiety, how autism is associated with anxiety. There's a strong correlation between being autistic and having anxiety. Obviously, the two are separate, and it's theoretically possible to be autistic and not to have anxiety, but the two very often go hand in hand together. It's very likely that if you're autistic, you're going to have more anxiety than you have if you weren't autistic. He says that being autistic does not mean that you will by definition be anxious, but it does obviously massively increase the likelihood that you are going to be anxious. Now, this is where I disagree with Luke Beardon here. He says that anxiety does not stem from being autistic alone. I disagree with him because, in my case, I'm a highly anxious person. I'm extremely neurotic. Interestingly, when I was a young child, very young child, I was unusually fearless, according to my parents. I didn't have the usual fears and anxieties that developmentally you would expect from a young child. I did not have stranger danger. I would walk off. I was quite happy in other people's company. I wasn't clingy. I didn't cry when I was left with other people. I didn't go through that stage that your children are expected to go through, which is interesting. I know anecdotally from what I've read that other autistics, it can be the other way around, where it can be have extreme stranger danger more than, say, a non-autistic. It seems to be either one or two extremes. But in my case, I didn't have stranger danger at all. And I was unusually fearless. But that changed from about the age of about 3 or 4. That state changed and I became increasingly neurotic. And then it kind of went the other way and I started to get increasingly anxious. But that wasn't the case when I was a very young child. And then that anxiety just got worse as I got older and became particularly bad in adolescence. It wasn't so bad. I mean, the signs of anxiety were there when I was a child, but it was more manageable back then. It became a lot worse when I was a teenager. But anxiety is now so deeply embedded within me, and I am a very neurotic person. And I think even when I was a young child, when I was fearless as a young child, I think I've always had a kind of, shall we say, neurotic temperament. Like, I would have extreme meltdowns, like, obviously all young children have meltdowns. I mean, well, they're called, tantrums, we call them when we talk about non-autistic kids. But, although the distinction between meltdown and tantrum, I sometimes quibble a little bit over. I know there is a distinction, or supposed to be a distinction, but I'm not quite sure without taking up a video. But I had, very extreme outbursts when I was restrained or put into my pushchair, and they went on a lot longer than you'd expect, So I think I've always had a neurotic temperament. It's just, and I think that's because I was neurotic. And I think it is in my DNA. I think I'm genetically a highly strong person. That's how I am genetically. That's just how I'm made up. And while the inheritance for that of my autism might be different, so I might have inherited genes that make me anxious, and then the autism genes, and it all comes together. I kind of feel in a way that the likelihood is that my anxiety and autism are somehow related on a genetic neurological level. So just because that's how I feel, because they feel deeply embedded within me, like in my brain, because I haven't managed to cure myself and I've given up. I don't think I ever will, because I can manage them and I can work on them, but that's not the same thing as being able to be cured. And the reason why I can't cure myself, I mean, that's not to say I haven't, I think it's a bit of a fantasy, but I don't think I will be able to cure myself, let's face it, because they're in my brain, because this is something that is deeply embedded within my DNA. And so I think clearly it's a physical thing, it's in my brain. That's how I experience it, that's how I feel it. It feels physical because I haven't been able to cure myself. It's deeply embedded within my chemistry. I disagree when he says that it does not stem from being autistic alone, as if it's yes, obviously environment and psychology obviously impacts on the development of anxiety and how bad your anxiety is. Obviously in some environments I'm way more anxious than in others, but even in environments which are good for me, I still experience anxiety, so it's always there to a greater or lesser degree. So I do feel it's very heavily embedded within my being. So I do disagree with him a bit there, that somehow anxiety is primarily psychological thing and can be separable from the autism, because I think that all autistics are different, and I do think that for some autistics anxiety is part of their package. It's very much a kind of neurological bedfellow of autism. The two are almost joined at the hip, He says there's a high risk of anxiety, but he emphasises more the environment. And he says that autism and environment equals outcome. Yes, I do agree with him, but at the same time, I think that the extent of the environmental modification is always heavily mediated by the biological chemistry as well. And you can't separate the biological chemistry. And there's a high degree of biological anxiety is very much a biological state for some people, and it really does depend on the individual. For some it will be more environment, for some it will be more biology. I just think it's very complex. Okay, so I'm going to move on to video number 2 now to carry on reviewing his book Autism and Asperger's Syndrome. So moving on to video number 2 now.